So I'm going to come today with great news first from the economics department, is that the study of economic and social inequality is really at the heart, front and center in mainstream economics nowadays. As you have probably seen, there have been many studies on income inequality, and the compendium of which is the very well-known work of Thomas Piketty in Capital in the 21st Century. And that is something that has pushed economists to think very deeply about inequality, but not only income, which is what people earn as work, but also how this income gets accumulated over generations, leading to wealth inequality as well. And this is work that's been done by people like Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman. I wrote an article in the Maidan about wealth inequality and how zakat can play a role as a form of a global wealth tax, which is an idea that economists have been proposing and taking seriously. That's one way to look at it and implement it. And in the article, I argue for the creation of a transnational organization by Muslims that could be like a World Bank of the zakat. You can read that article in the Maidan. It has also some fun graphs like economists do. Not only gender on those dimensions, but also other dimensions such as gender. So a lot of work has looked at the wage gap between men and women, and this is something we take seriously and look at how, for example, fertility impacts those, stratification and racism, especially over the 2020s, discrimination since Gary Becker. So all of these are at the forefront now of economic research. It's not just at the periphery, but at the heart and center. However, I have less great news, which has to do with Islamic economics. Unfortunately, Islamic economics is not as present in the conversations on inequality in economics and hasn't had this impactful role. Okay? So how do people, however, this is not just because, why Islamic economics? It's because, on the contrary, religion itself has played an important role in our understanding of economics and economic growth, even in the mainstream. And I quote, "In the past 2 decades, the empirical growth literature has seen a renewed interest in the relationship between religion and political economic performance. This voluminous body of work, which traces its intellectual roots to the pioneering study of Weber, stresses the independent role of Protestant ethics in fostering economic progress and treats religious beliefs and attitudes as fundamental drivers of economic outcomes." So this is the standard of what religion plays. However, when it comes to Islamic economics, which I want to start with, because I want to think of rethinking inequality through the lens of Islamic moral theology, talk about what is the status quo, where we are at in terms of its impact. So Timur Kuran, one of the academic experts on this question, wrote in his General Economic Perspectives 1995 review article about these distinguishing elements of Islamic economics. Islamic economics did not emerge from a drive to correct economic imbalances, injustices, or inequalities. The Indian Muslims who launched it in the 1940s were motivated by a desire to defend Islamic civilization against foreign cultural influences. For Sayyid Abdoulaye Maududi, the Pakistani ideologue, so these are the words of the Quran, not me, whose voluminous writings popularized the term Islamic economics and set the tone for later contributions to the literature, this new approach to economics was to be a vehicle for establishing and reestablishing Islamic authority in a domain where Muslims were falling increasingly under the influence of Western ideas. By replacing Western economic approaches with an Islamic one, he hoped to restore the Islamic community's self-respect and improve its cohesion. Because Islamic economics was developed to serve cultural and political ends, it did not have to meet scientific standards of coherence, precision, and realism. It needed only to differentiate itself from the intellectual traditions that it was aiming to displace. End quote. So there is some reality in that, in terms of methodology. This field was more using tools that are outside of the mainstream of economics. So the question is, how can we rethink these economic questions and shed light on what Islam can bring to the table? So that's why my talk will have 3 questions. And the first one has to do with the empirics first, talking about the lay of the land. What do economists think about inequality in Muslim societies, for example, as a practical thing? And the second question is, what could Islamic moral theology tell us about economic inequality and how to combat it? And the third question is, looking to the future, how can we test our interpretations of the discourse of scripture on inequalities, and how can we formulate sensible economic policies to mitigate the consequences of inequality? And so I hope to have the help of all of you here to address these questions. So let's go over the first one and some thoughts, preliminary thoughts on this. So the first one is, when it comes to what do economists think about inequality in Muslim societies and where the status quo is. There is a conjecture about the origins of Islamic institutions. So now we're talking about origins in the past, being linked to inequality. And the reasoning comes from the chapter on the Quraysh. I'm going to quote the chapter. It's a very short chapter, 4 different ayahs, from the translation of Yusuf Ali. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. For the covenants of security and safeguard enjoyed by the Quraysh, their covenants covering journeys by winter and summer, let them adore the Lord of this house, who provide them with food against hunger and with security against fear of danger. So the conjecture about this emergence of Islamic institutions comes as follows for economists when it comes to inequality. Geography and trade had a key role in the adoption of Islamic economic institutions. At the time, there was inequality in agricultural productivity that creates differences and gains from trade between different regions, some being more desertic, some being more green, favorable to agriculture. This fostered, according to the conjecture still, because this is still, there are only, the evidence is not that strong, predatory behavior from the less privileged tribes, and the static redistribution was not self-enforcing, and this led and evolved into intergenerational transfers. So Islam, by having a more redistributive system that was more dynamic, which is across generation, inheritance law, and all that, fragmented wealth and reduced inequality in exchange for secure passage to conduct trade. So that's the economic rationale behind how Islam relates to inequality and how the emergence itself was to combat inequality for secure passage to trade. And now, the second piece of how economists think of inequality in Muslim societies is a claim. And this is a claim also in the work of Quran, which is that the laws of inheritance limited inequality at the cost of limiting capital accumulation and limiting the potential for growth. This is the second other claim. And then certainly these laws of inheritance then reduced inequality, but at the cost of productivity, which is this idea behind also this Max Weber idea of Protestants bringing productivity through this ethic of work. Whereas Islam, according to economists, it's the opposite. And the other claim as well, because most of these works are very few in numbers, is that the Waqf redistribution system and public provision of goods system came also at the cost of locking capital in unproductive activities because they were locked under the name of the provider of the Waqf who would put this endowment for a very specific use, and that wouldn't change depending on the environment we're in. Those are the main considerations that economists think. Now when I zoom out myself, I ask the question, what could Islamic moral theology tell us about economic inequality, depending on our interpretations. So the first thought that I have when it comes to that is on the nature of inequality itself. Our scriptures do not take it as something that is unethical per se, that everyone has to be equal, but there are specific groups that are to be helped, to be taken care of, for which there should be redistribution, like Muhammad has written in his brilliant piece for the Maidan. We can think of the faqir as one group, poor, the miskin as well as the indigent or the poor, the yatim, the orphans, as well as the asir, the captive being often the group of people that is missing in economic discourse when we talk about inequality. They are just in prisons, and we do not study much their well-being. We study them from the perspective of crime, but not from the perspective of well-being as well. The second point, what I think of what could Islamic moral theology tell us about economic inequality, is on our role when it comes to inequality and as human beings in society. Rizq being a providence from God and putting God into the picture, the economic picture is not one anymore where, according to methodology economists, what we do is we have preferences, and these preferences give us what we call utility and under limited resources. And once we switch from this economy, in a sense where there is a God, these resources are the rizq, and we are guardians of these resources. And that brings also some environmental aspects as well that we need to think of in the question of inequality. And the third and last point, I think, is what we should do about this inequality. And this, my preliminary approach to think about this is to address these within the methodology and vocabulary and ways of economists to find convincing, rather than just reinventing the wheel or do like the creating a separate field that is what was the 1940s Islamic economics, like being it at the mainstream. Because Islamic moral theology tells us a lot of things about income redistribution, right? Islamic teachings on charity, zakat, and the support for the less fortunate are very related to the economic concept of income redistribution, which involve transferring wealth from those who have more to those who have less to achieve a fairer distribution of income and reduce inequality. So this brings questions of how can we implement these. My article was one foray on that, and look forward to exploring this further. Social justice as an important part of thinking of inequality. The idea of treating all individuals fairly regardless of their economic status aligns with the economic concept of social justice, okay? That sometimes contradicts with the notions of capitalism, where sometimes it's just the price that is put on things, which doesn't put at the forefront social justice. Okay? Ethical economics as well, ethical concerns, the emphasis of ethical behavior on economic dealings is one aspect that is missing. And this ethical economics really much can enter into the line of how we think of ESGs, environmental, social, and governance studies. Poverty alleviation in general is something that is a concept that economists think about a lot, but that is understudied. This recognition that we all have not necessarily unlimited wants, but minimum needs to alleviate. And finally, a few other pieces, some for which have been kind of dealt with. The question of interest-free finance, which has been some of the attempt that Islamic finance has tried to get to, and some aspects when it comes to labor economics, which is part of my study, the encouragement of the labor market and the dignity of labor. The encouragement of work and the dignity of labor are concepts that are important in labor economics and are missing in economic discord. So we can study the labor market dynamics through this lens, thinking of what dignity of labor means. And these are all principles of Islamic moral theology that provide a unique perspective in economic issues and that can be analyzed through the lens of mainstream economics. And finally, I'm going to end, because I'm going to get time, to my last question, which is really looking to the future now. How can the MEIS department help? Okay, how can we test these interpretations that I mentioned of these policies using both what would be, for ethnographers, it would be interviews. For us, our interviewees is data. How can we use data to test out these, test some of these claims and some of these conjectures? How can we test our interpretations of discourse of structural inequality and formulate sensible economic policies to mitigate the consequences of inequality? In my first article, I made a proposal there, connecting it to the question of this global wealth tax, of how we can create kind of a world bank of the Muslim world that can do zakat and help with this redistribution across countries. For all of these other points I mentioned, from dignity of work to ethical economics, to wealth inequality, to social justice and income redistribution, we ponder how we can address these within the confine of mainstream economics. Thank you.